In 1915, a Cleveland surgeon's wife held her third daughter, Barbara, in a Boston nursery and decided, in a thought she would later tell her oldest girl about in detail, that the family was going to leave the upper middle class for good. 23 years later, that daughter would be Mrs. William S. Paley. Her older sister, Betsey, would be Mrs. John Hay Whitney. Her oldest sister, Minnie, would be Mrs. Vincent Astor. 3 daughters from a Boston surgeon's house had taken 3 of the largest fortunes in 20th century America. The plan had worked. Then the plan started to eat the daughters who had executed it. If you enjoy stories the polite history books leave out, hit subscribe so the next one finds you on the night it goes up. Stay with me. The 3 sisters won the game so completely it stopped being a game. Chapter 1. The Surgeon's Wife Who Decided to Climb. In a Cleveland house in 1906, a 37-year-old woman named Katharine Cushing made a decision about her daughters that would take 50 years to play out. She was sitting in the front parlor of a modest 2-story house on the east side of Cleveland. Her husband, Harvey, was 37 and the chief surgeon at Lakeside Hospital. She had just delivered her second daughter, the baby they were calling Minnie. She had a 3-year-old son, Henry, already asleep upstairs, and an older son, William, at his lessons in the next room. She would have 2 more daughters in the next 9 years. She knew, sitting in that parlor in 1906, that her husband was going to be famous. She also knew that famous in Cleveland was not famous in the world she wanted her daughters to enter. She had married Harvey Cushing in 1892. She was 23, and he was a 23-year-old medical resident. She had loved him then, and would love him for 57 years. What she had not loved was the social weight her husband had brought to the marriage. The Cushings were a respectable Cleveland family. They were not, in the way that mattered in 1906, anything more than that. The senior men of Cleveland sat on the boards. The senior women of Cleveland ran the charities. The Cushings were respectable middle-ranking attendees. They were not the people the engraved invitations were addressed to first. Katharine had grown up watching her own family stand on the edge of that same circle. Her father had been a Cleveland lawyer of moderate reputation. Her mother had hosted small dinners. The pattern had been the same. Cleveland had a ceiling. The Cushings would never be the family at the top of it. She accepted this for herself. She did not intend to accept it for her daughters. Harvey came home that evening. He had spent the day in the operating theater at Lakeside. He kissed Minnie on the forehead. He sat in the chair across from his wife. They talked about the day. They did not talk about what she had decided. She would not tell Harvey about the decision for the rest of his life. Harvey believed his daughters should marry within his own intellectual world. He had no interest in social climbing. He was, in his own moral framework, opposed to the entire idea. Katharine knew this. She loved him. She also knew that the climbing was going to happen anyway. She would simply not bother him with the details. The decision she made that evening had 3 parts. The first part was that her daughters were going to be raised, from the youngest age, to be the wives of major American fortunes. The second part was that the wives of major American fortunes lived in New York, not in Cleveland or Boston. The third part was that the engineering of the marriages would begin immediately and would never stop until each daughter was successfully placed. She knew the family was going to leave Cleveland. Harvey had been talking with a Boston hospital for 2 years. The position at Brigham would come within 5 years. The family would move. The girls would grow up in Boston. Boston was not New York, but Boston was closer to New York than Cleveland was. Boston had Harvard. Boston had the right finishing schools. Boston had the social channels that ran into the New York system. She could work with Boston. The third daughter, the one she had not yet given birth to, was Babe. She would not arrive until 1915. By then, the family would be living on Walnut Street in Brookline. Harvey would be surgeon-in-chief at Peter Bent Brigham Hospital. The Cushing children would be entering the Boston system. The oldest girl, Minnie, would already be at Westover. The middle girl, Betsey, would be enrolled the following year. Katharine ran the household with an intensity that the family staff, in later interviews after her death, would describe as a kind of military operation. The girls' dresses were chosen for the right photograph. The girls' dance lessons were chosen for the right social skills. The girls' summer plans were chosen for the right introductions. The girls' reading lists were chosen for the right conversational range. Nothing was left to chance. Harvey, in the surgical office at Brigham, was operating on the brains of the wealthy. He had no idea that his wife was operating on his daughter's futures with the same precision he was operating on the cortexes of his patients. The two operations went on in parallel for 30 years. Harvey's work earned a Pulitzer Prize in 1926 and a worldwide reputation as the founder of modern brain surgery. Katharine's work earned 3 marriages that put her daughters at the center of American old money. Neither parent ever quite acknowledged the other's project as comparable. They both were right not to. The projects were comparable. Katharine's quiet realization, sitting in that Cleveland parlor in 1906, was that her daughters were going to have to do the climbing themselves. She could lay the trail, she could provide the training, she could open the doors. She could not actually walk through the doors for them. The decision the daughters would have to make, the decision to use what their mother had taught them to climb out of the world they had been born into, would have to be made by each daughter on her own. Katharine made the bet that all 3 of her daughters would make that decision. She won the bet. The bet cost the daughters more than anyone in that Cleveland parlor in 1906 could have imagined. But the cost would not arrive for 40 years. By the time it arrived, Katharine would be dead, and the daughters would be too far inside the lives she had engineered for them to reverse anything. Chapter 2. 3 daughters built to be wives. By 1924, the 3 Cushing daughters had been enrolled in a finishing school whose entire curriculum was about how to marry above their station. Westover School in Middlebury, Connecticut, had been founded in 1909 to prepare the daughters of the upper middle class for entry into the marriage market of the upper class. The school's brochure did not put it in those words. The brochure used the language of culture and refinement. The actual function of the school was understood by every mother who sent her daughter there. Westover converted a respectable surgeon's daughter into the kind of young woman who could function inside a Newport drawing room without being immediately recognized as new money. Westover taught French, it taught music, it taught drawing, it taught deportment, it taught the calling card system, it taught the rules of formal entertaining, it taught the proper response to a visiting card from a higher rank. It taught the correct social usage of every piece of silver, china, and crystal on a formal table. It did not teach much else. Mathematics was minimal. History was English royalty-focused. Literature was 19th century moral. The girls received what amounted to professional training in how to function as the wife of a major American fortune. The Cushing girls excelled at it. Minnie went first, arriving at Westover in 1920 at age 14. She was a quiet, observant student. She read widely on her own. She made the friends she needed to make. She came home for the summers and reported to her mother on the social position of every classmate. Betsey followed in 1922 at 14. She was the more academically curious of the two. She struggled with the limits of the Westover curriculum. She read books from the headmistress's private library after dinner. She made the friends she needed to make. Babe followed in 1928 at 13. She was the most strikingly beautiful of the 3. The school's headmistress, by her own later account, watched Babe's first arrival and recognized within a single hour that this 3rd Cushing girl was something different from the first 2. Babe was going to do something significant. The headmistress made a note. The summers were planned with similar precision. Katharine placed the girls at the Watch Hill Resort in Rhode Island, on the very northern edge of the Newport circuit. Watch Hill was Newport's overflow. The truly senior Newport families summered at the Breakers, at Marble House, and at the Newport itself. Watch Hill held the second tier. It held the families whose senior members had been at Newport once but were no longer. The families whose children would be friends with the Newport children, and the families like the Cushings who were positioning themselves to enter the senior tier through marriage. Watch Hill was where the Cushing girls met their generation. Betsey met James Roosevelt at a Watch Hill tennis week in 1927. He was 20. She was 19. They were both students at Harvard area schools. The Roosevelt connection had been opened in the first place through Katharine's introduction of Eleanor Roosevelt through a Cleveland connection. Eleanor had taken an interest in Betsey. The interest had translated into invitations to Hyde Park. Hyde Park was where the marriage was finally arranged. Minnie met her first set of New York young men at Watch Hill in 1924. She was 18. She did not marry any of them. Her marriage to Vincent Astor would come later and through a different channel. But Watch Hill was the first place in her adult life where she sat at a table with the children of the Astors, the Vanderbilts, the Whitneys, and the Phippses, all on more or less equal footing. Babe was too young in the 1920s to be playing the marriage market actively. She was being shaped. Her clothes were being chosen. Her hair was being styled. Her photographs were being taken by the Boston photographer of choice for upper-middle-class debutantes. By 1933, when she was 18 and ready for the debutante season, she would be the most photographed of the three. The Vogue staff would notice her at the New York Junior League ball that year. The first feature on her would appear in Vogue in 1934. She had not yet married anyone. She was already a magazine fixture. This was, in the Cushing strategy, an enormous achievement. A Cushing daughter had been recognized by the magazines that defined American taste before she had married into any fortune at all. The marriages began arriving in the 1930s and reached their first peak in 1940. By June of 1940, all three sisters were married. Betsey had married James Roosevelt in June of 1930. Minnie had married Vincent Astor on April 30th, 1940. Babe had married Stanley Mortimer, Jr. on September 21st, 1940. In a single calendar year, the Cushing Project had placed three daughters in three of the most recognizable American social households. The senior Cushing was a president's daughter-in-law. The middle Cushing was the new Mrs. Astor. The youngest Cushing had married into Standard Oil. Katharine Cushing, 69 years old in 1940, attended each of the three weddings. The wedding photographs from the 1940 year show her, small and gray and exhausted, standing behind whichever daughter had just been delivered to her major American fortune. The expression in the photographs is, by any honest reading of them, the expression of a woman who has won a 34-year war and is too tired to celebrate it. Harvey Cushing did not see Betsey's marriage end or Minnie's marriage to Vincent. He died on the 7th of October, 1939, of a stroke at his Yale University office. He had been retired from Brigham for 6 years. He had finally moved to Yale to take a quieter teaching role. He had won the Pulitzer in 1926 for his biography of Sir William Osler. He had founded modern brain surgery. He had operated on at least 2,000 brain tumors across his career. He was 70. He was widely regarded as one of the great American physicians of his generation. The obituaries ran across the country. None of them mentioned the daughters. Katharine wrote letters during the late 1940s to a Boston friend named Helen Whitney, the wife of one of Harvey's surgical colleagues. The letters, which survive in the Cleveland Historical Society Cushing family papers, describe the daughters' marriages with a level of strategic satisfaction that has, in the historical record, surprised some readers. Katharine is matter-of-fact about what she accomplished. She speaks of the Astor marriage as a positioning achievement. She speaks of the Paley marriage, when it comes in 1947, as the largest single coup of the campaign. She refers to her daughters by their married names throughout. She does not, in any of the surviving letters, express any concern about how the daughters are doing inside the marriages. The marriages were the accomplishment. The interior of the marriages was the daughters' own business. Chapter 3. Minnie Cushing marries. The last living Astor. In April 1940, a 34-year-old Minnie Cushing accepted a marriage proposal from the man who owned at that moment more of Midtown Manhattan than any other American. Vincent Astor was 48. He was the head of the surviving American Astor fortune. He had been the senior trustee of the Astor real estate empire since his father, John Jacob Astor IV, had drowned on the Titanic on April 15, 1912. Vincent had inherited the Astor estate at 21. He had been head of the family for 28 years by the time he met Minnie. The Astor fortune at the 1940 valuation was approximately $75 million in declared assets. The actual valuation, including the holdings that had been moved off the formal estate books to reduce taxation, was closer to $120 million. Today, this is approximately $2 billion. The principal assets were New York City real estate. The Astor estate owned, at any given time during Vincent's career, approximately 12% of the income-producing real estate in Midtown Manhattan. The Astor estate owned the original Saint Regis Hotel. The Astor estate owned the Astoria Hotel building before the Astoria merged with the Waldorf to become the Waldorf Astoria. The Astor estate owned Vincent's Ferncliff in Rhinebeck, the 700-acre Hudson River estate. The Astor estate owned the St. Regis Seacliff property on Long Island. The Astor estate owned a Bermuda house called Ferry Reach. Vincent personally owned, separately from the family trusts, the yacht Norma Hall, 263 feet, the largest privately owned diesel yacht in the world, at her commissioning in 1928. Vincent also personally owned, after 1937, a controlling interest in the magazine Newsweek. The marriage took place at a small private ceremony in New York. Minnie was Vincent's second wife. His first wife, Helen Dinsmore Huntington, had divorced him in early 1940 after 26 years of marriage. The first marriage had been childless. The reasons for the divorce had not been formally stated in the Reno filings. Helen had stipulated mental cruelty. The Astor family lawyers had asked her not to publicize the specifics. She had agreed. She had taken a settlement of $3 million and had left for Europe. She would die in 1976 in Geneva. She had not married again. Vincent met Minnie through Minnie's older brother, Henry Cushing, who had been Vincent's college classmate. Henry had introduced them at a New York dinner in late 1939. Vincent had been recently divorced and had been looking for a second wife. Minnie was 33, intelligent, beautiful, and from a respectable family. She was the kind of woman Vincent's senior advisors had told him he should marry to repair the social damage of the public Helen divorce. He had taken the advice. What Vincent did not understand at the dinner, and what Minnie had understood within 10 minutes of meeting him, was that Vincent Astor was an extremely difficult man. He was the head of the largest American real estate empire of the moment. He was also depressive, given to rages, and, by the standards of his own decade, a drinker of remarkable consistency. He drank from breakfast onward. He drank through dinner. He drank in the boxes at the opera. He drank on the Norma Hall. He drank at Ferncliff. He drank in front of the household staff. He drank in front of his first wife and would drink in front of his second. Minnie had decided, by the second dinner she had with Vincent in early 1940, that she could absorb the drinking and the depression and the rages and could manage the household and could make a place for herself inside the Astor world that her younger sisters could leverage for their own marriages. She had calculated correctly that the marriage was a foundational positioning event for the entire Cushing project. If she succeeded as Mrs. Vincent Astor, the Astor name would open doors for Betsey and Babe that nothing else could open. If she failed, the project would not necessarily collapse, but it would lose its single largest asset. She accepted Vincent's proposal in late March 1940. The wedding was on April 30th at the bishop's residence on East 68th Street. It was a small ceremony. The witnesses were Henry Cushing, Mrs. Cushing, the surviving mother, Harvey having died 7 months earlier, and Vincent's senior estate attorney. Betsey and James Roosevelt attended. Babe, 6 months from her own marriage to Stanley Mortimer, attended. The New York Times reported the marriage on page 3 of the Society section the following morning. The Cushing family was, with the announcement, at the center of the American social landscape for the first time. Katharine Cushing attended the wedding in a dark blue silk dress with a single string of pearls. Her photograph in the New York Times reception line on the wedding day shows her smiling, controlled, and watchful. She was 69. She had 3 daughters in the right marriages. She had crossed the line. The expression in the photograph is not quite happiness. It is the controlled satisfaction of a woman who has executed a long campaign and has finally seen the first major objective achieved. The morning after the wedding, Minnie left for Ferncliff for the first time as Mrs. Astor. The Cushing strategy had crossed the line. The Cushing family had its first place at the center of American old money. What was about to happen inside Ferncliff would test, for the first time in 40 years of careful planning, what the Cushing strategy actually cost the daughter who was paying for it. Chapter 4. The Ferncliff Marriage That Did Not Work. Inside Ferncliff, the 700-acre Astor estate on the Hudson, Minnie discovered within 3 years that the most powerful man in New York was also the most dangerous person she had ever lived with. The Ferncliff estate sat on a stretch of the Hudson River at Rhinebeck, 90 miles north of Manhattan. The main house had been built in 1860 by William B. Astor as a country retreat for the Astor family. It had 34 rooms. The estate ran to 700 acres of woodland, pasture, formal garden, and river frontage. The staff included a butler, 3 footmen, 2 cooks, 6 kitchen maids, 8 housemaids, 4 gardeners, 3 stable hands, a chauffeur, a private secretary, and a personal nurse for Vincent. Vincent's drinking, which had been steady during the courtship, became more intense after the wedding. He began drinking at breakfast. He drank a small bottle of whiskey before lunch. He drank wine through lunch. He He drank brandy through the afternoon. He drank cocktails before dinner and wine during. He drank brandy after dinner. By 11 in the evening, he was, on most evenings, drunk enough that the household staff had been instructed to make sure he reached his bedroom safely. The instruction had come, originally, from Helen Dinsmore Huntington. The instruction continued under Minnie. The drinking produced the rages. The rages were directed at Minnie, at the staff, at the dogs, and at the Astor real estate empire itself, which Vincent despised. The rages would last between 15 minutes and 2 hours. They typically involved Vincent throwing objects at the wall, throwing objects at the floor, and occasionally throwing objects at the staff or at his wife. The staff had been trained to leave the room during a rage. Minnie had not received any training. She stayed in the room. She absorbed what was thrown at her. She did not, by the consistent later testimony of household members, ever provoke a rage. She also did not retreat. She had decided that the marriage was a strategic asset and that the rages were part of the cost. Her sisters witnessed the rages. Betsey and Babe visited Ferncliff multiple times a year through the early 40s and 50s. They saw Vincent at dinner. They saw the throwing. They heard the shouting. They saw Minnie, by the later account of both sisters, walk Vincent to his bedroom at 11 in the evening with the same controlled composure she had brought to the wedding. Betsey's first husband, James Roosevelt, visited Ferncliff in 1941, before his own divorce from Betsey. He told his second wife, Ramel, years later, that Vincent Astor was the single most frightening man he had ever met in a private home. Vincent's depression was treated, beginning in 1947, with electroconvulsive therapy at McLean Hospital outside Boston. The treatment was, at the time, considered the best available option for severe clinical depression. Vincent went voluntarily, on the recommendation of his New York psychiatrist. He went 4 times across the period from 1947 to 1951. Each visit lasted approximately 3 weeks. The treatment was, by the standards of the era, brutal. Vincent received between 6 and 12 sessions of induced seizures. He returned to Ferncliff each time more subdued, then within 6 weeks, more violent than before. Minnie ran Ferncliff alone during Vincent's hospitalizations. She kept the household functioning, she paid the staff, she received visitors, she corresponded with the Astor estate office in Manhattan. She made the decisions about the gardens, about the kennels, about the boats. She maintained the public marriage by attending the few major Astor events that Vincent's schedule required while he was at McLean. She was photographed at the Opera in 1949, alone in the Astor box, looking quietly composed. The marriage continued through the 1940s and into the 50s on this rhythm. Vincent would rage, Minnie would absorb, Vincent would be hospitalized, Minnie would run the estate, Vincent would return, the rages would resume. The household staff turnover was constant. 3 different butlers across the 13 years, 5 different head housekeepers, 2 different head gardeners. The departures were never publicly explained. The staff knew. They did not talk. By the early 1950s, Minnie was beginning to plan her exit. She had absorbed 13 years of rage. She had executed the strategic positioning the Cushing project required. The Astor name had opened the doors for Babe's marriage to Bill Paley in 1947 and for Betsey's social rehabilitation through the Whitney marriage in 1942. The Cushing project had used the Astor platform. The platform had served its function. Minnie's exit required a replacement. She could not simply divorce Vincent and leave him alone at Ferncliff. He would die within months. The estate had no other family. Vincent had no other functional relationships. Minnie identified, through her own social circle, a woman who could absorb the marriage on her behalf. The woman was Brooke Russell Marshall, an Army widow in her early 50s, with a quiet, steady temperament and substantial reserves of patience. Brooke had been widowed in 1952. She was looking for a second husband. Minnie introduced her to Vincent at a New York dinner in early 1953. Vincent responded immediately. Brooke responded with quiet calculation. Within 4 months, the transfer was arranged. Minnie filed for divorce in Reno on the 27th of October, 1953, after a 6-week residency. The grounds were mental cruelty. The settlement was approximately $5 million in a single payment. Minnie left Ferncliff on the day of the divorce. Vincent married Brooke 6 weeks later. Brooke moved into Ferncliff. Vincent died in 1959 of a heart attack at his Manhattan apartment. Brooke inherited the Astor fortune. Brooke went on to give away approximately $200 million to New York charities across the next 47 years. Brooke became the public Mrs. Astor of the second half of the 20th century. Minnie, by her own quiet choice, became the woman who had handed the marriage to another woman. The Cushing Project had used the Astor name for 13 years. The project had survived the marriage. Minnie had survived the marriage. The cost had been the daily absorption of a violent, depressive alcoholic for the entire prime of her young womanhood. Minnie was 47 when she walked out of Ferncliff. She had spent her 30s and her early 40s inside Vincent's rage. She had given the Cushing Project what the project had asked of her. She had also lost 13 years of her own life. She would have, after the divorce, 25 years of quieter life with James Fosburgh. The 25 years would, by her own account and later correspondence with Marianne Moore, be the only happy years of her adult life. She had paid the Astor price. The Cushing Project had collected. Chapter 5. Betsey's First Marriage and the President's Son. While Minnie was learning what marriage to Vincent Astor actually meant, her younger sister Betsey was learning the same lesson with James Roosevelt. The Roosevelt marriage had begun in 1930 at the Hyde Park estate of Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt. The wedding was the small private ceremony of the eldest son of a New York governor who was about to become president. The bride was the 22-year-old middle Cushing daughter. The groom was the 22-year-old eldest son, recently graduated from Harvard, expected to enter law and business, expected to be one of the public faces of his father's political career. The expectations were, in 1930, plausible. James Roosevelt was an attractive, charming, restless young man. He had inherited his father's social magnetism and his mother's serious moral conscience in unequal proportions. He had inherited a great deal of the social magnetism and not a great deal of the moral conscience. He was, in the language of the Hyde Park staff who watched him grow up, the son who took after Franklin in style and after his great-uncle Theodore in temperament. He was going to be charming. He was going to be a serial cad. He was going to be a public figure. Betsey had been engineered by Katharine Cushing to be the Roosevelt daughter-in-law. The introduction had come through Eleanor Roosevelt, whom Katharine had courted through a Cleveland connection across the late 1920s. Eleanor liked Betsey. Eleanor saw in Betsey a quiet, intelligent, observant young woman who would, Eleanor believed, be a steadying influence on the Roosevelt eldest son. Eleanor was wrong about that. She would be wrong about it for the entire decade of the 1930s. She would not be wrong about the personal value of Betsey, however. Eleanor would correspond with Betsey for the rest of Eleanor's life, even after the divorce. The wedding was a Hyde Park event. Franklin Roosevelt was about to begin his presidential campaign. He was not yet the candidate. He was the New York governor. The wedding was at the Hyde Park Family Chapel on the 4th of June, 1930. The bride wore a Vogue feature-worthy gown of ivory satin. The bride's mother, Katharine, wore navy blue silk with a single string of pearls. The groom's mother, Eleanor, wore the same dress she had worn at her own daughter Anna's wedding 4 years earlier, because Eleanor did not believe in spending money on clothes. The bride's father, Harvey, performed his usual role at a Cushing daughter's wedding, which was to look distinguished, to be polite to the senior in-laws, and to say as little as possible about the social engineering involved. The marriage produced 2 daughters. Sarah Delano Roosevelt was born in 1932. Kate Roosevelt was born in 1936. The daughters would, after the divorce, be raised by Betsey at Greentree under the surname of Roosevelt, and would maintain a relationship with their Roosevelt grandparents and their Roosevelt cousins. They would not have a meaningful relationship with their father after about 1942. James Roosevelt would essentially absent himself from their lives. The pattern of the Roosevelt marriage was set by 1932. James was unfaithful to Betsey from the first year of the marriage. The first documented affair was with a Cambridge undergraduate woman in 1931. The second was with a Harvard Law School secretary in the spring of 1932. By the time Franklin Roosevelt won the presidential election in November 1932, James Roosevelt was conducting affairs at roughly a 1-per-month pace. He was charming. He was attentive to the women involved. He did not, by any account, consider himself a cruel husband. He simply did not believe that fidelity was the structure within which his life would operate. Betsey was 24 in 1932. She was the wife of the president's eldest son. She had a young child. She had a second pregnancy ahead. She had no public role of her own. She lived in a half-furnished apartment in Cambridge while James completed his law degree. She lived, after 1933, in a series of rentals near the various Roosevelt summer houses on Campobello in Maine. She traveled to Washington for major White House events. She was photographed at the right occasions in the right dresses. She maintained the public role of the president's daughter-in-law for the entire decade of the 1930s. What she did not have, across the entire decade, was a husband who actually lived with her. James spent most of the 1930s in Washington, at the side of his father, working on the administration's interpersonal politics. He was a man of considerable political talent for managing senior politicians for his father. He was, in this respect, his father's most useful aide. He was also a man whose private life took place entirely outside the marriage. The pattern of his 1930s life involved long stretches in Washington hotel rooms with women who were not Betsey, occasional weekend visits to wherever Betsey was, and a public posture of devoted son-in-law of the surgeon Harvey Cushing and devoted husband of the steady Betsey. The press never covered the affairs during the 1930s. The Roosevelt White House had an unspoken agreement with the major American newspapers that personal lives of the family would not be reported. The agreement held for the entire decade. The affairs were known to the senior White House staff. The affairs were known to the Cushing family. The affairs were not known to the readers of the New York Times. Betsey absorbed the knowledge. She did not, at any point in the marriage, confront James publicly. She confronted him privately on at least 4 documented occasions, including in 1934 when the second daughter, Kate, was 9 months old, and in 1937 when Betsey discovered that James had been involved with one of her own personal friends. The confrontations went the same way each time. James apologized. James agreed to stop. James promised that this would be the last. James was lying. He knew he was lying. He did not, in any sense that the marriage could survive, intend to stop. By 1939, Betsey had decided that the marriage was over. She had absorbed 9 years of infidelity. She had 2 daughters whose father had effectively abandoned them. She had a public role that was demanding and exhausting, and that provided her with no private compensation. She began, quietly, to plan her own exit. The model was Minnie's slow strategic preparation for the Astor exit. The execution would be faster, because the Roosevelt marriage had been more publicly damaged. Betsey filed for divorce in Reno on the 18th of April, 1940. The grounds were incompatibility. The settlement was modest, because James Roosevelt had no personal fortune separate from his father's political career. Betsey took custody of the 2 daughters. James remarried within 4 months to a nurse named Rommel Teresa Schneider, with whom he had been involved for at least 2 years before the divorce. Rommel had been the catalyst. James had decided that he wanted to be married to Rommel. He had asked Betsey for the divorce. He had not contested any of the terms. The Roosevelt White House never publicly acknowledged the divorce. Franklin Roosevelt sent Betsey a personal letter expressing his regret. Eleanor sent Betsey a longer letter expressing her affection and her continued friendship. The 2 letters survive in the Whitney family papers at Yale. Eleanor and Betsey would correspond, in fact, for the rest of Eleanor's life. The Roosevelt grandchildren, Sarah and Kate, would maintain a relationship with their Roosevelt grandparents through Eleanor's intervention. The Cushing project had survived its first public failure. The marriage had ended in a Reno divorce, the most public possible end. The Roosevelt name was a casualty. The Cushing name was not. Betsey was 32. She had 2 daughters. She had a divorce. She had no fortune of her own and no immediate prospects. The Cushing project would need to find her a second husband. The project would need to find her a husband whose own family fortune and personal stability were sufficient to absorb a 32-year-old divorced daughter-in-law of the President of the United States. The project found Jock Whitney. The wedding was on the 8th of August, 1942, at the St. James Episcopal Church in New York. Jock was 38, never married, the heir to the largest combined Whitney and Hay fortune in the United States, $200 million in 1944 dollars. He had been quietly looking for the right wife for a decade. He had met Betsey through the Roosevelt social circle in the late 1930s. He had been waiting for the Roosevelt marriage to end. When it ended, he proposed within 6 months. The Cushing project had executed its first replacement marriage. The replacement was better than the original. Chapter 6. Babe Cushing marries her way out of Boston. At 25, the youngest sister married a Standard Oil drunk and discovered in 6 years that the first marriage was not going to be the last. Stanley Grafton Mortimer Jr. was an heir to the Standard Oil fortune through his mother's family, the Tilfords. He was attractive, athletic, charming in the standard way of his class, and a documented alcoholic by his 25th birthday. The drinking had begun, in the Mortimer family's later account, around the time Stanley left Princeton in 1934. By 1940, when he married Babe Cushing, he was drinking from breakfast onward. The marriage took place on the 21st of September, 1940, at the Sherry Netherland Hotel in New York. Babe was 25 and the most beautiful of the three Cushing sisters by general consensus. She had been featured in Vogue 6 times already. She had been photographed by Cecil Beaton, by Horst, and by Edward Steichen. She was, in 1940, the recognized social beauty of her generation. The Vogue editors had begun calling her by her first name in casual reference. Diana Vreeland would later say that Babe Paley in 1940 was the only American woman who had ever made being a debutante look like an art form. The Mortimer marriage was supposed to be Babe's entry into the New York social oil money world. Stanley Mortimer's mother had been a Tilford. The Tilfords had been Standard Oil shareholders since the 1870s. The Mortimer fortune was solid, established, and respectable. It was not, by Cushing standards, the largest possible target. Babe could have married into Whitney or Paley or Astor money. She did not. The reason was simple. The Whitney heir was unavailable. He was waiting for Betsey. The Paley heir had not yet entered Babe's social circle. The Astor heir was already married to Minnie. Babe married Stanley because Stanley was available and because the Mortimer family was respectable enough to be a satisfactory first marriage. The Cushing project had decided, by 1939, that the youngest sister would need at least one marriage to establish her own credentials before the largest possible marriage could be arranged. Stanley was the staging ground. The strategy had not anticipated Stanley's alcoholism. The marriage produced 2 children. Stanley Mortimer III was born in 1942. Amanda Mortimer was born in 1944. Amanda would later marry Carter Burden II and would produce Carter Burden III, the New York real estate figure of the 1970s and 80s. The Mortimer children were raised after the divorce by Babe at the Saint Regis penthouse and then at Kiluna Farm. The Mortimer marriage failed in stages. The first year went well. Stanley was on his best behavior. Babe was occupied with the first pregnancy. The household at the Mortimer family residence in Roslyn ran smoothly. The second year began the deterioration. Stanley's drinking, which had been controlled during the engagement and the early marriage, returned to its pre-marriage levels by the spring of 1942. He began drinking at breakfast. He began drinking through lunch. He began arriving at evening events with a noticeable slur. Babe began making excuses for him. The excuses ran out by 1943. The pattern that broke the marriage was Stanley's behavior at social events. By 1944, Stanley had developed a habit of proposing to other women at dinner parties Babe was hosting and forgetting by the next morning what he had done. The first documented incident was at a Mortimer family dinner in November 1944. Stanley had proposed to a Tilford cousin who had been seated next to him. The cousin had thought he was joking. He had been entirely serious. Babe had been informed of the proposal the following morning by her sister Minnie, who had been at the dinner. Babe had asked Stanley about the proposal. Stanley had no memory of having made it. Babe had told Minnie that the marriage was now in trouble. The second documented incident was at a New York dinner in March 1945. Stanley had proposed to a wife of one of his Princeton classmates. The classmate had been present. Stanley had no memory of having made the proposal. Babe had concluded after this second incident that Stanley's alcoholism had reached a point at which the public marriage was no longer maintainable. The third documented incident was at a Long Island weekend party in August 1946. Stanley had proposed to a woman who was at the party as Babe's personal guest. The proposal had been made in front of approximately 30 other guests. Babe had walked out of the party. She had spent the night at Minnie's house. She had filed for divorce within the week. The divorce came through quickly. Stanley did not contest any of the terms. The Mortimer family settled at approximately $100,000 and full custody of the two children. Babe moved to a smaller apartment on Park Avenue with the two children. She withdrew from public visibility for almost 2 years. She was photographed only at family events. She did not attend major society parties. She did not give magazine interviews. She did not appear in the columns. She had been, in her own private terms, embarrassed by the Mortimer marriage. She intended to be more careful with the next one. The next one was arranged by Minnie. Bill Paley had been a regular at the Astor Circle since the late 1930s. He was, in 1947, 37 years old, recently divorced from his first wife Dorothy Hart Hearst, and looking for his second. Bill Paley had founded CBS in 1928 at age 27. He had built the network into the second largest American broadcasting institution. He was personally worth approximately $25 million in 1947 and rising. He was Jewish, which made him an unusual social figure in the predominantly Protestant American old money world. But his money and his social ambition more than compensated for the religious distinction in the eyes of the Cushing strategy. Minnie introduced Babe to Bill at an Astor family dinner in late winter 1947. Babe was 31. Bill was 37. They began seeing each other within weeks. They were engaged by summer. They were married on the 28th of July, 1947, at a small ceremony at Kiluna Farm, the Long Island estate Bill had bought from his first marriage. The honeymoon was at a Caribbean island. They returned to New York in late August. Babe moved into the Saint Regis penthouse on the same day the honeymoon ended. The Saint Regis Hotel sat at 5th Avenue and 55th Street. It had been the original Astor flagship hotel, owned by the Astor family since John Jacob Astor IV had built it. By 1947, the Astors still owned the hotel building, but the Paleys leased the penthouse triplex. The triplex had 27 rooms across 3 floors. The view ran from Central Park to the East River. Babe would redecorate the penthouse 3 times across the marriage, each redecoration costing between $150,000 and $400,000. The first redecoration began the week she moved in. She had been waiting, by her own later account, for 13 years to have an apartment of this size to decorate. She moved her mother's portrait into the formal living room. She moved her sister Minnie's portrait into the library. She moved Bill Paley's portrait into the dining room. She placed her own portrait in the master bedroom. The Cushing project had executed its 3rd major marriage. The youngest sister was now married to the founder of CBS. The strategic placement was complete. Babe was Mrs. Paley. The penthouse was hers. The clothes would come, the photographs would come, the best dressed list would come. The 13 years of public peak were about to begin. The cost of those 13 years would not become visible until they were almost over. Ira, Chapter 7. The penthouse, the couture, the cameras. For the next 13 years, Babe Paley became the most photographed and most copied American non-actress of her generation. The first International Best Dressed List induction came in 1947, the year she married Bill Paley. The Hall of Fame induction came in 1958. She would be inducted into the Hall of Fame an additional 13 times after that, for a total of 14 inductions, more than any other American woman in the history of the list. The Hall of Fame inductions ran consecutively from 1958 to 1972. Babe was, by simple measurement, the dominant figure of the American Best Dressed system for 15 years. The clothes themselves were the public expression of the marriage. Babe shopped at Main Boucher in New York, at Givenchy in Paris, at Saint Laurent at Avenue Marceau, and at Balenciaga at Avenue George V. The custom Main Boucher suits cost between $2,000 and $3,500 each in the 1960s. Babe ordered approximately 18 suits a year from Main Boucher alone. The Givenchy gowns cost between $3,000 and $7,000 each. Babe ordered approximately 12 gowns a year from Givenchy. The Balenciaga day dresses cost between $1,500 and $3,000. Babe ordered approximately 20 day dresses a year from Balenciaga. The total annual wardrobe budget ran between $100,000 and $150,000 across the 1960s, equivalent today to between $900,000 and $1.5 million annually. The wardrobe room at Kiluna Farm covered 2 floors of a wing of the main house. The room was temperature controlled. The hangers were custom-carved cedar with leather-covered shoulders to maintain the line of each garment. The shoe room was a separate adjoining space with 300 pairs at any given time. The hat room was a third adjoining space with 120 hats in rotation. Babe was reportedly never photographed in the same evening dress twice. She rotated the wardrobe with the assistance of a personal maid, Edith, who had been with her since 1947. Edith maintained the inventory. Edith kept the records of which dress had been worn at which event. Edith was responsible for the cleaning and storage of every garment that returned from a wearing. The Paley apartments and houses ran in parallel. The Saint Regis penthouse was the New York residence. Kiluna Farm on Long Island was the country residence. The Paley apartments in Paris and London were the European bases for the season. The Lyford K House on New Providence Island in the Bahamas was the Caribbean winter base. The total full-time staff across the 4 principal residences ran to approximately 27 employees at the peak. Babe managed the staff. She personally interviewed every senior household employee. She personally approved every menu for major dinner parties. She personally selected every flower arrangement for every public event. The dinner parties were the central performance. Babe entertained approximately 40 times a year at the Saint Regis penthouse. The standard guest list ran between 16 and 24. The menu was prepared by the Paley cook, a French woman named Maria, who had been with the family since 1949. The table settings rotated across 3 principal sets of crystal, 2 sets of china, and a single sterling silver service that Babe had inherited from her mother, Katharine, in 1949. The flowers were arranged by Babe personally in the late afternoon of each dinner day. The dinner began at 8:30. The senior guests were seated at Babe's right at the round dining table that seated 20. Bill Paley sat opposite Babe at the far end of the table. The photographs from this period define the visual memory of mid-century American old money. Slim Aarons photographed the 3 Cushing sisters together at Kiluna Farm in 1957 for Town and Country. The photograph appeared in the February 1958 issue. The 3 sisters are arranged on a sofa in front of a fireplace. Minnie is on the left in a Chanel suit. Betsey is in the center in a main Boucher dress. Babe is on the right in a Givenchy day dress with the simple pearl earrings and the cigarette in her hand that would become her visual signature. The photograph is the iconic image of the Cushing project completed. 3 sisters from a Boston surgeon's house at the absolute center of the American old money world, photographed in the country house owned by the husband of the youngest sister, by the photographer who defined the period's visual record of itself. The Whitney Embassy years in London ran from 1957 to 1961. Jock Whitney was American ambassador to the court of St. James under President Eisenhower. Betsey was the American hostess of London for those 4 years. The Whitney Embassy at 14, Prince's Gate, a Regent's Park townhouse, was the central social institution of the Eisenhower administration's relationship with the United Kingdom. The Queen attended 4 embassy parties across the 4 years. Winston Churchill, in his retirement, attended 1. Anthony Eden, the outgoing Prime Minister, attended several. Harold Macmillan, the incoming Prime Minister, attended many. Betsey was photographed at every event. She wore Maine Boucher and Norman Hartnell. She was, by the British press, treated as the equivalent of an unofficial American royalty. Minnie's contribution to the public peak was quieter, but no less consequential. Her second marriage to James Whitney Fosberg, established in 1953, produced a Manhattan townhouse at 66th Street and Park Avenue that became the principal informal salon for American writers, painters, and intellectuals of the period. Minnie corresponded with Marianne Moore and Truman Capote across the 1950s and 60s. She corresponded with Cecil Beaton, who photographed her and James at 66th Street in 1960 for Vogue. The Vogue feature ran across 6 pages. The article portrayed the Fosbergs as the model of an American intellectual's second marriage. The article was, by Cushing standards, an entirely successful public placement. The senior Cushings collectively, in the period from 1957 to 1967, were photographed in the same room with 3 American presidents, 2 British prime ministers, 1 English queen, 4 reigning Vanderbilts, and every major American social figure of the era. The Cushing project had reached its peak. The 3 sisters were at the center of every photograph of American old money that mattered. Their mother, Katharine, had died on the 17th of January, 1949 in Boston of complications from pneumonia. She was 79. She had lived long enough to see the Cushing project succeed. She had watched Betsey marry Jock Whitney. She had watched Babe marry Bill Paley. She had watched Minnie become Mrs. Astor. She had attended each of the 3 weddings. She had not, by the surviving correspondence, expressed any meaningful concern about how any of her daughters were doing inside the marriages. The marriages were the project. The lives inside the marriages were not her concern. Katharine had executed the campaign. She had won. She had died with the campaign secured. The 13 public peak years of the Cushing project were the years between Katharine's death and the publication of La Cote Basque. The pattern of the years was photographs, dinners, ambassadorships, and the steady accumulation of the public memory of the 3 sisters as the women at the center of American old money. The pattern would hold until 1975. When the pattern broke, it would break in the most public possible way. Chapter 8. What Bill Paley Did in Every Hotel. Behind the public. Mrs. Paley was a private Mrs. Paley who knew about every affair her husband had ever had, and could not figure out what to do with the knowledge. Bill Paley's infidelity to Babe began in the first year of the marriage. The first documented affair was in 1948, with a CBS production secretary in the network's New York offices. The affair lasted 4 months. The secretary was paid a quiet severance at its conclusion. The pattern that would define the next 30 years of the marriage was set within 12 months of the wedding. Bill Paley had been a serial, unfaithful husband during his first marriage to Dorothy Hart Hearst. Babe had known this before she married him. She had been told by Minnie, who had been told by mutual friends in the Astor circle, that Bill's first marriage had ended in part because of his continuous extramarital activity. Babe had concluded that the second marriage would be different. The second marriage would be the marriage in which Bill settled down. Babe had been wrong about this. Bill had not settled down for his first wife. He would not settle down for his second. The affairs across the 31 years of the Paley marriage ran into the high dozens by the consistent later account of Bill Paley's biographer, Sally Bedell Smith. The pattern was approximately this. Bill would meet a woman through CBS, through New York society, or through Babe's own personal circle. He would pursue the woman discreetly. The affair would last between 2 months and a year. Bill would end it. He would move on to the next. He maintained the public marriage with complete discipline. He attended Babe's dinners. He sat opposite her at the long table. He attended the embassy parties when the Whitneys were in London. He attended Kate Paley's confirmation. He attended Bill Jr.'s first day at Yale. He was the public Mr. Paley with the same precision that Babe was the public Mrs. Paley. The discovery in 1949 was the first crack in Babe's private understanding of the marriage. The woman involved was within Babe's own group of close friends. She was a woman named Pamela Hartwell, the wife of Lord Hartwell. Pamela had been a friend of Babe's since the 1947 London introductions. Babe had recommended her to the Paley social circle. Pamela had been Bill Paley's mistress for 3 months. The affair had been discovered when a servant at the Paley apartment had reported to Babe that Pamela had been in the apartment when Bill had been alone. Babe had confronted Bill. He had apologized. He had stopped seeing Pamela. The friendship between Babe and Pamela had ended formally and immediately. The pattern continued. The mistresses across the 1950s were, by Sally Bedell Smith's careful documentation, approximately 15 women. Several were within Babe's social circle. Several were not. Bill Paley was discreet, but not perfectly discreet. Babe was perceptive, but not entirely perceptive. The marriage continued to function publicly. The Saint Regis dinners continued. Kiluna Farm continued. The best dressed list inductions continued. Babe redecorated the penthouse for the second time in 1956. The redecoration cost approximately $275,000. By the 1960s, the pattern had stabilized. Bill Paley would call from his CBS office in the late afternoon. He would tell Babe that he would be working late. Babe would understand that working late did not mean working. She would tell the household staff to set dinner for one in the formal dining room. She would eat at the long table alone, with the standard table setting, the standard menu, the standard wine, and a single candle. She would then go upstairs to the wardrobe room and select the next day's clothes. The pattern repeated, by her own later count to her sister Minnie, between 2 and 4 times a week across the 1960s. The Marie Harriman story is the central anecdote in this period. Marie Norton. Whitney Harriman was the wife of W. Averell Harriman, the New York governor and former Secretary of Commerce. She had been a Whitney by her first marriage to Cornelius Vanderbilt Whitney, the cousin of Jock Whitney. She had been part of Babe's broader social circle for 2 decades. She was a friend, not a close friend, but a recognized member of the same world. By the consistent later testimony of Babe's intimate friends, Bill Paley had a brief affair with Marie Harriman at some point in the early 1960s. The affair lasted, by Sally Bedell Smith's reconstruction, approximately 6 weeks. The location of the affair was a hotel room in New York, the detail that Babe later confided to Truman Capote, and that Capote would later reconstruct in La Cote Basque, was that Marie had been menstruating at the time of one of the encounters, and that the hotel bedspread had been stained, and that the cleaning staff had reported the stain to the hotel manager, who had quietly reported it to Bill's personal assistant, who had quietly reported it to Bill. Bill had then quietly reported a sanitized version of the story to Babe, who had reconstructed the actual story from the gaps in his sanitized account. Babe had asked Bill whether the woman was Marie Harriman. Bill had not denied it. This is the detail that Capote would publish in 1975 as fiction in Esquire. The character of the husband would be a thinly disguised version of Bill Paley. The character of the wife would be a thinly disguised Babe. The character of the menstruating mistress would be a thinly disguised Marie Harriman. The publication would end every social friendship Capote had built across the previous 15 years. Truman Capote had become Babe's closest confidant after 1960. The two met in 1955 through a New York lunch arranged by Babe's social secretary. Capote was 31. Babe was 40. The friendship grew through the 1950s and exploded into closeness in the 1960s. Capote spent weekends at Kiluna Farm. He spent weeks at the Saint Regis penthouse. He flew with the Paleys on the company plane to Lyford Cay. He was, in Babe's own social presentation, the friend who could go anywhere. He was the writer who understood her. He was the gay best friend who would never compete and never report back. Babe told him everything. She told him about the Pamela Hartwell discovery. She told him about the CBS secretaries. She told him about Marie Harriman. She told him about the nights she ate alone at the long dining table. She told him about the second redecoration of the penthouse, which had been her way of converting the loneliness of 1956 into an aesthetic project that could be accomplished. She told him about the wardrobe. She told him about the cigarettes. She told him about the fear that the lung cancer she would later be diagnosed with was already by the early 1970s beginning to develop. She told him about every interior detail of a marriage she could not figure out how to leave. Capote took notes. Capote always took notes. Capote took the notes for 15 years and assembled them by the early 1970s into the first chapter of a novel he was calling Answered Prayers. The novel was the great announced literary project of Capote's late career. He had been promising it since 1966. He had been paid handsome advances from his publisher's Random House. He had not, by 1974, delivered any of it. He had decided in 1974 that he would publish one chapter as an excerpt in Esquire. The chapter would be the Cote Basque chapter. The chapter would contain the Marie Harriman story. The chapter would contain Babe Paley as the fictional Cleo Dillon, and would contain every confidence Babe had ever shared with him, slightly disguised but easily identifiable to anyone in the Paley circle. Capote believed, in his own private reconstruction later in his collapse, that Babe would forgive him. He believed that the literary quality of the work would override the personal betrayal. He believed that Babe loved him enough to forgive anything. He was wrong about all of this. The publication would end the friendship and would, in the most direct sense, hasten Babe's already advanced lung cancer toward its final stages. Babe would never speak to Capote again. The 3 years between the November 1975 Esquire publication and Babe's death in July 1978 would be the years in which Babe systematically erased Capote from every social fact of the Paley world. Chapter 9. The Black and White Ball and the Coming Betrayal. In November 1966, Truman Capote threw the most photographed private party in American social history, And the three Cushing sisters were the women at the center of every photograph. The black and white ball was held at the Plaza Hotel in New York on the night of the 28th of November, 1966. The host was Truman Capote. The guest of honor was Katharine Graham, the publisher of the Washington Post. The guest list was 540 people. The dress code was black and white only. The masks were required. The ball began at 10 in the evening and ended at 3 in the morning. Capote had been planning the ball since the spring of 1965. He had worked on the guest list with Babe Paley at Kiluna Farm across the summer. The guest list was the central performance. Capote believed, by his own private account to Babe, that the guest list was the single most important social document of the decade. To be on the list was to be confirmed as a member of the international set Capote had constructed around himself. To be off the list was, in Capote's terminology, to be confirmed as nobody. The list was political. It included Frank Sinatra and Mia Farrow. It included Henry Ford II. It included Lauren Bacall. It included Tallulah Bankhead. It included Marianne Moore, the poet Minnie corresponded with. It included Henry Kissinger. It included Norman Mailer. It included Andy Warhol. It included Princess Lee Radziwill, Jacqueline Kennedy's sister, and one of Capote's swans. It included Cecil Beaton. It included Slim Keith. It included Morella Agnelli. It included Gloria Guinness. It included Anne Woodward, who, in 1966, had been on the Capote list for the previous 9 years, even though Capote privately referred to her as the murderess. Anne had shot her husband William Woodward Jr. dead in 1955 and had not been indicted. And, at the center, it included the three Cushing sisters, Babe Paley as the senior swan, Minnie Fosberg, Betsey Whitney. The Cushing trio occupied table number 1 at the supper. Babe was photographed entering the Plaza ballroom in a Mon Boucher black evening dress with a white feather mask. The photograph appeared in Life magazine, in Time magazine, in Newsweek, in the New York Times, and in approximately 300 other newspapers across the United States and Europe within 72 hours. The ball was, by every external measurement, the apex of the public Cushing era. The three sisters from a Boston surgeon's house were at the center of the most photographed private party in American history. The strategy Katharine had begun in 1906 had, by 1966, succeeded so completely that the host of the most important party of the year was, in effect, building the entire event around them. What Capote was already privately planning was the destruction of all of it. He had begun making notes for answered prayers in 1964. The notes had focused from the beginning on the swans. He was, by his own private account in later interviews, increasingly resentful of the social position the swans occupied without working for it. He had worked for his literary success. He had written Other Voices, Other Rooms in 1948. He had written Breakfast at Tiffany's in 1958. He had written In Cold Blood in 1966. He had been, by 1966, the most famous American writer of his generation. He believed his own work was equal to or superior to anything the swans had accomplished in their lives. He believed they did not respect him sufficiently for what he had accomplished. The resentment grew across the late 1960s. Capote's drinking, which had been steady since the 1950s, increased through the 70s. His drug use began. His own next major literary project, the novel that was supposed to be Answered Prayers, did not materialize. He had been paid handsome advances. He had nothing finished. The pressure from his publishers grew. The pressure from his own ego grew. He decided, in 1974, that the answer was to publish a chapter. The chapter would be La Cote Basque, 1975. The chapter would be set in the actual La Cote Basque restaurant on East 55th Street, the lunch place of choice for the New York old money women of the period. The structure of the chapter would be a long lunch between two women, one of them based on Capote himself in drag, the character Jonesy, the other based loosely on Slim Keith, the character Lady Ina Coolberth. Across the lunch, the women would gossip about every other woman they knew. The gossip would include the Marie Harriman story Babe had told Capote. The gossip would include Anne Woodward's murder of her husband. The gossip would include a Joseph Kennedy seduction, story that Capote had heard from Lee Radziwill. The gossip would include a series of other vignettes drawn directly from the Swan's private confidences. Capote signed the deal with Esquire in early 1975. The fee was $16,000. He sent the manuscript to the magazine in August. The editors at Esquire understood immediately what they had. They scheduled the piece for the November issue. They locked the layout. They printed the cover. The cover was a photograph of Capote in dark glasses with the headline, La Cote Basque, 1975. The Esquire issue went on sale on October 27, 1975. The magazine reached the Saint Regis penthouse on Tuesday afternoon, October 28th. Babe opened the magazine in the late afternoon. She read the Cote Basque story in approximately 45 minutes. She did not finish reading the issue. She put it down on the coffee table. She telephoned her sister Betsey at Greentree. She read selected passages over the telephone. Betsey called Minnie at 66th Street. Minnie came to the St. Regis penthouse the same evening. The three sisters sat in the formal living room. Babe wept quietly. Minnie and Betsey did not weep. They simply sat with her. Bill Paley arrived from the office at 9 in the evening. He had heard about the story from a CBS colleague who had seen the early Esquire copies. He read the story in 15 minutes. He set the magazine down. He told Babe that Capote would never be welcome in any house associated with the Paley family for the rest of his life. Babe nodded. The next morning, Babe began the systematic erasure of Capote from her social world. She telephoned her social secretary. She instructed that Capote was to be removed from every guest list for every Paley event scheduled across the next 12 months. She instructed that any letter from Capote was to be returned unopened. She instructed that any telephone call from Capote was to be refused. She did not write Capote a letter. She did not telephone him. She simply, in the precise language her mother had taught her at Westover, dropped him. Truman Capote understood within 2 days that he had miscalculated. By Wednesday, October 29th, he had received letters from Slim Keith, Lee Radziwill, Morella Agnelli, and Gloria Guinness, all of whom were also dropping him. By Friday, October the 31st, he had received a single-line note from Ann Woodward's mother telling him that Ann had died on Friday, October 10th by overdose, 3 weeks before the publication after seeing an advance copy of the Esquire issue. Capote sat in his United Nations Plaza apartment that evening. He drank a bottle of vodka. He cried. He telephoned his social secretary. He asked her to telephone Babe Paley. The secretary returned the call within 15 minutes. Babe was not available. Babe would not be available again. The Cote Basque destruction was a public event by the end of November 1975. The newspapers covered the Swan's rejection of Capote. The columnists analyzed the social significance. The literary critics analyzed the artistic significance. Capote did not understand any of this. He believed that the Swans would eventually return. He believed that his greatness as a writer would compel them to forgive the betrayal. He was wrong about this for the next 9 years of his life. Babe Paley would die in July 1978 without speaking to him again. Minnie Fosberg would die in October 1978 without speaking to him again. Slim Keith would die in 1990 without speaking to him again. Lee Radziwill would not speak to him after 1975 for the rest of his life. Capote's social world ended on the day La Cote Basque appeared in Esquire. His literary work ended within the next 2 years. His drinking accelerated. His drug use accelerated. He died on the 25th of August, 1984, at 59 in a borrowed Bel Air bedroom in Los Angeles, alone, with no Cushing sister or any other Swan in any room of any house associated with him. The Cushing strategy had survived its first major public betrayal. The strategy had not, however, survived without cost. Babe Paley would not. The lung cancer would arrive within months. Chapter 10. Minnie's Quiet Exit. While Babe lay dying in Manhattan in the early summer of 1978, her oldest sister Minnie was already dead. Minnie had been the first of the 3 Cushing sisters to leave the world. She had been diagnosed with breast cancer in late 1977. The cancer had been advanced at the time of diagnosis. The treatment options had been limited. She had been told, in February 1978, that she had between 4 and 8 months to live. The diagnosis came 4 months after the death of her second husband, James Whitney Fosberg. James had died on the 18th of January 1978 of complications from a stroke. He had been 70. He and Minnie had been married for 25 years. The marriage had been, by Minnie's own private account, in letters to her sisters and to Marianne Moore, the happiest 25 years of her adult life. The Fosburgh marriage had begun in 1953 at the 66th Street townhouse the Fosburghs had purchased together. James had been a painter of moderate success, a quiet man, 8 years younger than Minnie, of an independent intellectual disposition. He had no inherited wealth of his own. He lived on the proceeds of his painting and on Minnie's settlement from the Astor divorce. The Fosburgh life had been small, comfortable, and culturally rich. They had entertained writers, painters, and intellectuals. They had not entertained at the scale of Babe's Saint Regis dinners or Betsey's Green Tree weekends. They had entertained at the scale of an intelligent New York couple who knew interesting people and could afford to feed them. The Fosburgh townhouse on 66th Street had been the principal informal salon of the Manhattan literary world across the 1960s and 70s. Marianne Moore had been a regular guest from 1956 until her death in 1972. W. H. Auden had attended dinners at the Fosburgh house. Truman Capote, in the years before Cote Basque, had been a regular. Robert Lowell had attended several Fosburgh evenings. The conversations had ranged across 1950s poetry, the New York art scene, and the publishing world Minnie had quietly assembled an interest in across the 1950s. Cecil Beaton had photographed the Fosburghs at home in 1960 for Vogue. The 6-page feature, which Beaton had personally arranged with the Vogue editor, had been the public introduction of the second Minnie. The article had described Minnie as a woman who had built a quieter and happier marriage after the public failure of her first. The article had been, by Cushing standards, an entirely successful public placement. Vincent Astor had read the article in his bath at Ferncliff and had reportedly torn out the pages and burned them in the fireplace. He had died 11 months later. The Fosburgh life had ended with James's stroke in the autumn of 1977. James had spent 12 weeks at New York Hospital. Minnie had been at his bedside for most of the 12 weeks. The stroke had been severe. James had not regained meaningful function. He had died on the 18th of January 1978 at 69. Minnie had returned to the 66th Street townhouse alone. She had been 72. She had spent the next month making arrangements for James's estate and for her own future. The breast cancer diagnosis came in February. Minnie did not tell Babe. Babe was already at an advanced stage of lung cancer and was, by Minnie's own assessment, not in a position to absorb a second sister's terminal illness. Minnie told Betsey. Betsey came to 66th Street twice a week across the next 8 months. Minnie continued to receive correspondence, to read, to write letters to Marianne Moore's literary executor about the Moore collected works, and to plan her own estate. The estate was approximately $3 million in cash, securities, and the 66th Street townhouse. Minnie left the bulk to the Metropolitan Museum of Art for the acquisition of 19th-century French paintings. She left specific paintings to the New York Public Library. She left her personal correspondence to the Cleveland Historical Society to be added to the Cushing family papers. She left small bequests to her sister's children and grandchildren. She left her dogs to Betsey. She left her library to a small private foundation that was to maintain it as a reading room for the use of working writers. The foundation closed in 1983 when the principal ran out. The books were sold at auction. The reading room was closed. Minnie died on the 17th of October, 1978, in her bedroom at the 66th Street townhouse. She was 72. The funeral was held at St. James Episcopal Church in New York on the 21st of October. The mourners included Betsey, Bill Paley, Babe had been too ill to attend, Jock Whitney, approximately 30 members of the New York literary world Minnie had cultivated across her second marriage, and a small number of senior figures from the Astor world Minnie had quietly remained in touch with after the divorce. Brooke Astor was present. Brooke was now Mrs. Astor in the public sense Minnie had once been. The two had not been close after 1953. Brooke attended the funeral as a gesture of respect. Minnie's coffin was carried by James Fosburgh's brother, by Henry Cushing, by Bill Paley, and by Jock Whitney. Minnie was buried next to James Fosburgh at the Salisbury Cemetery in Connecticut. The headstone read, Mary Benedict Cushing Fosburgh, 1906 to 1978. There was no inscription. There were no quotations. Minnie had been the strategic one, the planner, the negotiator. The headstone was the dry, plain summary of the life of a woman who had married first the most powerful man in New York, second, a quiet painter she had loved for 25 years, and who had died 4 months after his death of the same disease that was killing her younger sister at the same time. Babe had not been able to travel to the Salisbury funeral. She had been at Kiluna Farm with the inner circle of 3 or 4 people who had remained loyal during the final 2 years. She had received the news of Minnie's death on the morning of October 17th. She had cried briefly, by the account of the household nurse who had been with her at the time. She had then asked for the curtains in the bedroom to be drawn. She had spent the rest of the day in bed reading old letters from Minnie. She would die 9 months later. Chapter 11. Babe's Last Birthday. On the 5th of July, 1978, Babe Paley turned 63 at Kiluna Farm, and her sisters and her 2 children were present, and her husband was not invited. The day began at Kiluna with the household staff bringing breakfast to Babe's bedroom at 7 in the morning. Babe had requested the same breakfast she had requested every morning for 31 years. The breakfast was coffee, half a grapefruit, 1 slice of toast, and a small glass of orange juice. The breakfast tray was placed on the bedside table. Babe ate 1 bite of the toast and drank half the coffee. She was 63. She had been dying of lung cancer for 3.5 years. She knew this would be her last birthday. The lung cancer diagnosis had come in November 1974. The original prognosis had been approximately 18 months. Babe had survived for 44 months. The doctors had been wrong. Babe had been right. She had decided, in early 1975, that she would survive long enough to die at Kiluna Farm in the high summer of a year in which Bill Paley was kept out of the house. She had calibrated the survival to that precise objective. She was, in the language of her sister Minnie's later account to Cecil Beaton, the only woman Minnie had ever known whose force of will could keep her alive past the doctor's projections by months at a time. The cancer had progressed through the 1975 Capote disaster. The cancer had progressed through the long, quiet retreat from public life across 1976 and 1977. The cancer had progressed through Minnie's terminal illness and death in the early autumn of 1977 and the first 9 months of 1978. The cancer had not, however, taken Babe before the 63rd birthday. The 63rd birthday was the date Babe had selected as her own death's deadline. The guest list for the birthday was small. Betsey Whitney was present. She had driven over from Greentree the previous evening. She would stay at Kiluna for 3 days. Jock Whitney had not come. He had stayed at Greentree. He had not been close enough to Babe in the final years for the awkwardness of his presence to be useful. Kate Paley, Babe's daughter, was present. Bill Paley Jr. was present. Babe's son, Stanley Mortimer III, the elder Paley stepson from the first marriage, was present. Babe's daughter, Amanda Mortimer Burden, was present. Babe's husband, Bill Paley, was not present and had not been invited. This had been Babe's specific instruction to the household staff. Bill had been at the Saint Regis penthouse in Manhattan since June. He had been told that Babe wanted to spend her birthday at Kiluna with her sisters and her children. He had not, by the household account, pressed the issue. He had understood. He had spent the day in Manhattan. He had eaten dinner alone at the long dining table at the Saint Regis. He had read in the library. He had gone to bed early. Babe at Kiluna had received birthday visits in the morning from Betsey, from Kate, and from Bill Jr. She had spent the morning in her bedroom. She had been dressed by her maid Edith, who had been with her since 1947. The dress was a simple white linen day dress from Givenchy that Babe had worn many times before. The shoes were flat. The jewelry was the simple pearl earrings she had been photographed in for the Town and Country feature in 1957. The Marlboro cigarette was not present. Babe had stopped smoking 18 months earlier on the orders of her oncologist. The cigarette had not, by her own account, been a difficult habit to break in the end. She had simply set down the last pack and never opened another one. The lunch was at 1 in the afternoon. The lunch was small. 6 people sat at the round breakfast table on the porch overlooking the Kiluna Gardens. The menu was light: cold soup, cold poached salmon, a green salad, strawberries, a small piece of chocolate cake with a single candle for Babe to blow out. Babe ate 2 bites of the salmon and 3 strawberries. She blew out the candle. She did not make a wish. She smiled at the assembled 6. She thanked them for being there. The afternoon was quiet. Babe rested in her bedroom for 3 hours. Betsey sat with her. Betsey did not speak much. Babe slept for some of the time. They watched the gardens through the bedroom window. At 5 in the afternoon, Babe woke and asked Betsey to read to her. Betsey read from a book of Marianne Moore poems that had been a gift from Minnie. Marianne Moore had died in 1972. Minnie had died in 1978. The Moore poems had survived. Babe listened with her eyes closed. Dinner was at 7 in the evening. The same 6 people gathered. The menu was light again. Babe ate very little. After dinner, Betsey and Kate sat with her in her bedroom until 10 in the evening. Then, Babe asked to be left alone to sleep. She slept until 5:30 in the morning. The next day, the 6th of July, 1978, was the day Babe Paley died. The death itself was quiet. Babe had been declining steadily for 2 weeks. The household nurse, who had been with the family since 1974, was present at the bedside at 5:30 in the morning when Babe began to fade. Betsey was sleeping in the bedroom across the hall. The nurse woke Betsey at 6 in the morning. Betsey came to Babe's bedside. Babe was conscious but not speaking. Betsey held her hand. The breathing slowed across the next hour. At 7:17 in the morning, the household physician, who had arrived shortly after Betsey, pronounced Babe dead. She was 63 and 1 day old. Bill Paley was informed by telephone at 7:30. He had been at the Saint Regis penthouse for breakfast. He came to Kiluna Farm immediately. He was at the house by 9:15. He went directly to Babe's bedroom. He sat with her body for approximately 20 minutes. He emerged with his eyes red but composed. He spoke with Betsey. He spoke with the children. He began the funeral arrangements. The funeral was held at St. James Episcopal Church on East 71st Street on the 11th of July, 1978. The Reverend Frederick H. Sontag conducted the service. The music had been specified by Babe in a written instruction left with her social secretary in 1976. The hymns were 2 simple Anglican hymns from the 1940s. The reading was from 1 Corinthians 13. The eulogy was given by Bill Paley. He spoke for approximately 12 minutes. He did not speak about the marriage. He spoke about Babe's taste, her grace, her devotion to her children, and her contribution to American style. He did not mention Truman Capote. He did not mention Marie Harriman. He did not mention the wardrobe room. He spoke about the public Babe Paley with the same precision with which the public Babe Paley had spent 31 years being constructed. The mourners numbered approximately 1,000. They included approximately 300 members of the broader Paley business circle from CBS. They included approximately 200 members of New York society. They included approximately 150 members of the fashion press. They included approximately 50 members of the design and decorating world. They included approximately 10 close friends of the Cushing family. They included none of the Swans except Morella Agnelli, who had flown from Turin specifically to attend. They did not include Truman Capote. Babe was buried at the Memorial Cemetery of St. John's Church at Cold Spring Harbor on Long Island near Kiluna Farm. The grave was a simple stone marker. The inscription read, Barbara Cushing, Paley, 1915 to 1978. There was no quotation. There was no description. Babe had specified the inscription in writing in 1977. She had wanted the headstone to be entirely plain. The day after the funeral, the Saint Regis penthouse was photographed by Architectural Digest for a memorial feature. The photographs ran in the November 1978 issue. The feature ran across 12 pages. The penthouse was preserved by Bill Paley for the next 12 years, exactly as Babe had left it. The wardrobe room at Kiluna was preserved for the next 4 years and then dispersed to the daughters and to the Metropolitan Museum Costume Institute. The Givenchy Day suit from 1964 was donated by Bill Paley Jr. to the Metropolitan in 1994. It has been exhibited 3 times. Chapter 12. What was the whole plan for? When Betsey Whitney died at Greentree in March 1998, the last Cushing sister was 89, and the question her family had spent 70 years executing was finally over. Betsey had outlived her 2 sisters by 20 years. She had outlived her husband Jock by 16 years. She had outlived her mother, Katharine, by 49 years. She had outlived her father, Harvey, by 59 years. The Cushing family had begun. In a Cleveland parlor in 1906, with a 37-year-old surgeon's wife making a decision about her daughters. The family ended in a green tree bedroom in 1998, with the last of those daughters dying quietly at 89 of natural causes in the bedroom she had occupied for 56 years. The Whitney marriage had been the most successful of the 6 Cushing marriages by any external measure. Betsey and Jock had been married for 40 years, from 1942 to 1982. Jock had been a loyal husband for the entirety of the marriage. He had not, by any documented account, taken a mistress across the 4 decades. He had been devoted to Betsey, devoted to the 2 Roosevelt stepdaughters, and devoted to the entertaining and philanthropic life the marriage produced. Greentree had been the apex of American Long Island estate living. The Whitney art collection had been the largest privately held collection of French Impressionist and Post-Impressionist painting in the United States. Jock had suffered a stroke in February 1979. He had lived for another 3.5 years at Greentree under continuous nursing care. Betsey had run the estate, the household, and the art collection across those 3.5 years. Jock had died on the 8th of February 1982 of complications from a second stroke. He was 77. The funeral was held at St. James Episcopal Church. The estate was approximately $1 billion at his death. The bulk passed to Betsey under the marriage settlement. Betsey had then run Greentree alone for 16 years until her own death on the 25th of March, 1998. She had been 89. The 16 years of her widowhood had been the quietest sustained period of any Cushing daughter's adult life. She had entertained at a reduced scale. She had visited her daughters Sarah and Kate frequently. She had visited her grandchildren. She had managed the Whitney Philanthropic Foundations. She had supervised the Whitney Art Collection. She had begun, in 1990, the process of arranging the donation of the bulk of the art collection to the National Gallery of Art in Washington upon her death. The Greentree Foundation had been established by Betsey in 1993. The foundation was to operate Greentree as a private conference center for nonprofit organizations, working on humanitarian and public policy issues after Betsey's death. The foundation was funded by a portion of the Whitney estate. The foundation continues to operate today. The Whitney house at Greentree remains as it was at Betsey's death, with the bedrooms and the public rooms maintained as they were in the 1950s. The Whitney bequest of 1998 was the formal art donation to the National Gallery of Art. The bequest included approximately 14 significant works: the Manet Boatman in Argenteuil, the Cézanne self-portrait, the Picasso family of Saltimbanque, 2 Matisses, 1 Renoir, 3 Degas, 2 Pissarros. The bequest was, by some art historical accounts, the most significant single donation of French Impressionist and Post-Impressionist painting to an American museum in the second half of the 20th century. Betsey died in her own bed at Greentree on the morning of the 25th of March, 1998. Her 2 daughters, Sarah and Kate, were present. The household nurse was present. The household physician was present. The death was quiet by natural causes, with no extended terminal illness. She had been functional until approximately 2 weeks before her death. The funeral was held at St. James Episcopal Church on the 29th of March. The mourners numbered approximately 700. They included approximately 50 senior members of the American philanthropic and art world. They included approximately 100 members of the Whitney business and family circle. They included the surviving Cushing grandchildren and great-grandchildren. They included no Truman Capote, who had been dead for 14 years. They included no Bill Paley, who had been dead for 8 years. They included no Vincent Astor, who had been dead for 39 years. The men who had been at the center of the Cushing story were all gone. Betsey was buried at the Whitney family plot in Greenwood Cemetery in Brooklyn. The headstone was a quiet pink granite marker. The inscription read, Elizabeth Cushing, Whitney 19, 08 to 1998. There was no quotation. There was no description. The Cushing daughters had, in each case, requested entirely plain headstones. The 3 headstones at the Memorial Cemetery at Cold Spring Harbor, at the Salisbury Cemetery in Connecticut, and at the Whitney plot at Greenwood Cemetery are nearly identical in their plainness. The 3 sisters who had been photographed by Cecil Beaton, by Horst, by Edward Steichen, by Slim Aarons, by Irving Penn, and by every major American magazine photographer for half a century, are buried under marker stones with no description of who they were. The question the entire 92-year arc of the Cushing project leaves us with is what the whole plan was actually for. Katharine Cushing decided, in a Cleveland parlor in 1906, that her daughters were going to climb out of the upper middle class. They did. They climbed all the way. They reached the top of American old money. They stayed there for 60 years. Between them, they were photographed by every photographer who mattered. They were married to 3 of the largest fortunes of the 20th century. They entertained presidents, queens, and prime ministers. They wore the most expensive clothes. They lived in the most beautiful houses. They were, by any measurable index, the most successful upper-middle-class infiltration of the American old money world ever accomplished. And then what? Babe died, refusing to allow her husband at her deathbed. Minnie died alone 4 months after the husband of her quiet second marriage. Betsey died 16 years after a husband she had genuinely loved, in a house she had run for 56 years, with a fortune she had inherited but had not entirely created, knowing that the green tree art was about to go to a museum, and that the Cushing daughters would not, after her, be present in any house at the center of American old money. The strategy had succeeded perfectly. The cost had been the lives of the 3 daughters who had executed it. The deeper question is whether the cost was, in some real sense, what the strategy had actually been for all along. Katharine Cushing had not, in any of her surviving correspondence, expressed concern about how her daughters were doing inside the marriages. The marriages were the accomplishment. The lives inside the marriages were not her concern. She had executed a long campaign with brilliance. She had been satisfied with the result. She had died secure that the family had been successfully transplanted. What she had not factored in, because no campaign of social engineering can factor in the interior of the lives it produces, was that the daughters would have to live every day for the rest of their lives inside the positions she had won for them. The positions were the cage, the clothes were the bars, the husbands were the wardens. The performance never ended. There was no point at which a woman like Babe Paley could stop being Mrs. William S. Paley. The position she had built her entire life to occupy was the only position available to her. She had calculated, with the cold precision her mother had taught her, that the public marriage was the asset she could not afford to surrender. She had been right about the calculation. The calculation had also been the design of her own cage. The Cushing sisters won the game so completely it stopped being a game. They built a position that consumed them as completely as the more famous tragic heiresses of the same century were consumed by the fortunes they had been born into. The difference is only that the Cushings climbed up before they were consumed. The consumption was the same, and the climb itself, the entire elegant, brilliant 50-year ascent from a Cleveland parlor to Green Tree, becomes in retrospect a slow, patient march toward the bedroom at Kiluna Farm on the morning of the 6th of July, 1978, where the youngest sister chose to die first. If you stayed with me through all 12 chapters, hit subscribe so the next old money story finds you the night it goes up. Tell me in the comments where you were watching from and which of the 3 Cushing sisters, knowing now what each of their marriages actually cost, you would have wanted to live a single year inside. Share this anywhere the story might find someone, on Facebook, on Reddit, in the family group chats. You are why this channel exists.